Hello Warhammer Universe enthusiast. Before you is the voice assistant of the podcast. I ask you to please like and subscribe for the spread of the greater good, if this information proves to be useful. Today we will listen to information about the Siege of Terra, the final and most pivotal battles of the Horus Heresy, a civil war that engulfed the Imperium of Man in the 31st millennium. The Solar War was a critical conflict in the Horus Heresy, with the traitorous forces of Horus seeking to take control of the Sol system, which included Terra, the capital of humanity. For several years, the Imperial Fists had been defending the system against the traitors, but the tide had been turning against them. The traitors had been making gains, slowly but surely pushing the defenders back. During the Solar War, one of the most significant events occurred when the Alpha Legion struck at Pluto. The Alpha Legion was a mysterious and enigmatic space marine legion, known for their ability to operate covertly and carry out complex operations. They were also known for their loyalty to Horus, and their willingness to carry out his orders, no matter how brutal or ruthless. The attack on Pluto was unexpected, and the defenders were caught off guard. The Alpha Legion struck swiftly and efficiently, overwhelming the defenders and seizing control of the planet. The Imperial Fists, who had been responsible for defending Pluto, were stunned by the sudden attack, and they were forced to withdraw to other positions. During the battle for Pluto, a legendary figure from the Alpha Legion, Alpharius, was seemingly killed by Rogal Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists. Alpharius was known for his mastery of deception and disguise, and he was considered one of the most dangerous opponents on the battlefield. His death was a significant blow to the traitors, and it was seen as a major victory for the defenders. However, the death of Alpharius was not without controversy. Some claimed that he was not really dead, and that he had simply faked his own death as part of a complex plan. Others believed that it was not Alpharius who had been killed, but rather one of his doubles, or a clone. The truth of what happened on Pluto remains a mystery to this day, and it continues to be a subject of much debate and speculation among the followers of Warhammer 40,000. The Imperium Secundus was a temporary political alliance formed between three of the most powerful space marine legions in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. Guilliman, Lion El'Jonson, and Sanguinius joined forces to create a new government that could rule in the absence of the Emperor. Initially, the Imperium Secundus appeared to be a successful experiment. The three Primarchs worked together to consolidate their power, and they succeeded in creating a relatively stable society that could resist the forces of chaos and other threats. However, the Imperium Secundus was not without its problems. The three Primarchs had very different personalities and priorities, and they clashed frequently over matters of policy and strategy. Guilliman was a pragmatic and rational leader, who believed in the power of bureaucracy and the importance of organization. El'Jonson was a secretive and enigmatic figure, who valued loyalty and secrecy above all else. Sanguinius was a charismatic and visionary leader, who sought to unite all of humanity under a banner of hope and optimism. These differences often led to political clashes and infighting, which undermined the effectiveness of the Imperium Secundus. Sanguinius, in particular, found himself caught in the middle of the disputes between Guilliman and El'Jonson, unable to negotiate a settlement between the two. It was during this time that Sanguinius began to have visions of the Emperor, which gave him hope that his father was still alive and that Terra still endured. These visions were shared by Conrad Kurz, the Primarch of the Night Lords, who had long been haunted by his own visions of the future. As the visions became more frequent and vivid, it became apparent that the Imperium Secundus was no longer sustainable. The three Primarchs, with the advice of their closest advisors, decided to abandon the Imperium Secundus and make their way to Terra, in the hopes of reuniting with the Emperor and ending the Horus Heresy once and for all. Sanguinius, Guilliman, and Lion L. Johnson decided to attempt to breach the Ruin Storm, a massive warp storm that had engulfed much of the galaxy and made travel impossible. The plan was to use the combined power of their fleets to punch through the storm and reach Terra. However, the journey was fraught with danger and difficulty. The Ruin Storm was filled with all manner of horrors and dangers, and the Primarchs and their forces were constantly beset by attacks from Chaos forces and other threats. In the end, only Sanguinius and the Blood Angels were able to reach Terra. Guilliman and Lion L. Johnson were forced to turn back, unable to breach the Ruin Storm and reach their destination. After Sanguinius successfully arrived on Terra, Lemon Russ set out on a mission to confront Horus, the traitor Warmaster who had caused so much devastation across the galaxy. The Space Wolves, who had been fighting alongside the other loyalist forces, were determined to take the fight directly to their enemy. Thanks to runes planted by infiltrating knights errant during the Battle of Molech, the Space Wolves were able to track the location of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship. Russ and his warriors engaged the forces of Chaos in a desperate battle as they fought their way towards Horus. The fate of the Imperium hung in the balance. Despite the ferocity of the fighting, Russ and Horus eventually came face to face, engaging in a brutal duel as the battle raged around them. The two champions clashed with titanic force, their weapons ringing out in the void of space. Russ was a master of close combat, but Horus was no slouch either, and the two seemed evenly matched. As the battle reached its climax, Russ was badly wounded, but in turn, he managed to wound Horus with the Spear of Russ. The blow was a turning point in the battle, as it cleansed much of the corruption that had befallen the Warmaster since his visit to Molech, a world steeped in dark sorcery. However, the battle came at a heavy cost for the Space Wolves. Many warriors fell in the fighting, and the chapter was left reeling. Russ was left in a comatose state, and his warriors were forced to flee to the world of Yarant. The Space Wolves narrowly avoided destruction at the hands of the sons of Horus' first captain Ezekiel Abaddon, who pursued them relentlessly across the void of space. The Raven Guard, led by Corax, came to the aid of the beleaguered Space Wolves. Together, the two chapters fought a fierce rearguard action against the forces of Chaos, buying time for the wounded Russ to be taken to safety. The combined forces of the Space Wolves and Raven Guard proved too much for Abaddon and his followers, and the traitors were forced to retreat. But despite these setbacks, Horus and his forces continued their advance towards Terra. To reach the Imperium throne world, they first had to capture the strategically vital Beta-Garmon cluster. The Beta-Garmon cluster was a region of space that contained many heavily fortified planets and moons, as well as vital warp routes that connected the traitor forces with the Sol system. Control of the cluster was essential for both sides, and the Imperium had spent centuries building up its defenses in anticipation of such an attack. The traitor forces, led by the Warmaster Horus himself, numbered in the millions and included many of the most elite units of the Chaos Space Marine legions. Their primary goal was to punch through the Imperial defenses and secure a beachhead from which to launch an assault on Terra itself. The Imperial forces were no less formidable, however. Comprising a wide variety of units drawn from across the Imperium, they were led by some of the greatest military minds of the age, including Lord Commander Solar Macarius and the legendary Space Marine Primarch Rogal Dorn. The battle began with a massive orbital bombardment of the planet Beta-Garmon 3 by traitor forces, followed by a series of ground assaults on key Imperial positions. The fighting was brutal and intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the early stages of the battle, the traitors seemed to have the upper hand, and they pushed deep into the Imperial defenses. The Imperial forces fought valiantly, however, and managed to hold the line. In particular, the Titan legions of the Legio Salaria played a critical role in the battle, engaging in fierce combat with the traitor Titans and helping to blunt their advance. As the fighting continued, both sides began to suffer from the punishing attrition of the battle. Casualties mounted on both sides, and neither could gain a decisive advantage. The battle became a grueling war of attrition, with each side fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground. Finally, after months of brutal fighting, the traitor forces managed to break through the Imperial defenses and secure a beachhead on Beta-Garmon 3. With this foothold established, they were able to push deeper into the cluster and gain control of several key planets and moons. Despite this setback, the Imperial defenders fought on with renewed determination. They launched a series of counterattacks against the traitor forces, and gradually began to regain ground. The Titan legions, in particular, played a key role in this phase of the battle, with their massive war engines smashing through enemy lines and wreaking havoc among the traitor forces. In the end, however, the traitor forces proved too strong, and the Imperial defenders were forced to retreat. They abandoned many of their fortifications and fell back to new defensive positions deeper in the cluster. The battle had been a costly one for both sides, with millions dead and entire worlds left in ruins. Following the Battle of Beta-Garmon, the Horus Heresy continued to escalate as the forces of chaos began to make their way towards the heart of the Imperium. With the door to the Sol system open, Horus was finally able to muster his forces on the planet of Ullanor, bringing together a massive army composed of a variety of different legions. Among the forces that rallied to Horus' side were the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, Thousand Sons, Death Guard, and Iron Warriors, each led by their respective Primarch. These legions were bolstered by the Night Lords, who were under the command of Captain Gender Skravok, and the Word Bearers, who had been led by Dark Apostle Zardu Layak. Despite their many differences and past conflicts, Horus was able to unite these forces under a common banner and lead them into the Sol system. It was there that they would face their most difficult challenge yet, as they sought to overthrow the Imperium and claim Terra for themselves. As the Siege of Terra loomed on the horizon, Horus deployed Perturabo and the Iron Warriors to fortify the captured Sol system against any who may attempt to intrude upon the siege. Their task was to build an impenetrable defense, one that would hold fast against the combined might of the loyalist forces. At the same time, Horus himself prepared to lead his armies towards Terra, hoping to capture the planet before the arrival of Rogal Dorn from the galactic east. The stakes were high, and the outcome of the conflict would determine the fate of the entire Imperium. Despite the odds against them, Horus and his forces advanced towards Terra, determined to crush the loyalists and claim victory for the forces of chaos. They encountered fierce resistance along the way, as the loyalist forces fought desperately to defend their home planet. Horus, having already taken control of the Sol system, had deployed his massive fleet in orbit around Terra, from where he launched a devastating bombardment. The bombardment was meant to weaken the defenses of the planet, and pave the way for a ground assault that would see the traitor forces take the Imperial Palace and the seat of the Emperor himself. The first shell fired by the traitor fleet targeted the Sanctum Imperialis, the personal quarters of the Emperor. The shell, fired for symbolic reasons, did no damage to the palace and was quickly intercepted by Terra's sophisticated anti-ship gun batteries. The loyalist defenders of Terra, comprising the Imperial Army, the Space Marines, and various other factions, immediately responded to the attack and opened fire on the traitor fleet. The exchange of fire between the two sides was vicious and intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. However, the sheer weight of numbers of the traitor fleet allowed them to endure the barrage and continue their assault. Horus' ultimate objective was the Imperial Palace, and he was determined to capture it at any cost. As the bombardment continued, Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, probed for weaknesses in the Aegis and eventually discovered a flaw around Bastion 16. The Aegis in this area was weakened enough to allow slow-moving aircraft to penetrate. Despite the impatience of Angron and the boredom of Fulgrim, Horus would not launch an all-out attack yet, knowing that the Emperor's might prevented diamonds from manifesting on Terra, and also threatened to destroy the demon Primarchs should they set foot upon its soil. Meanwhile, Magnus and Zardu Layak surmised a ritual to eliminate the Emperor's barrier by spilling enough blood across Terra. Horus began to spend more time comatose, his spirit inside the warp searching for lore and weakening the Emperor's spirit. Eventually, Horus designated First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon as his proxy. After 12 days of bombardment, the traitor forces launched their first ground assaults, with thousands of vessels crashing into Terra's surface. Many were destroyed by the palace defenses, but many more landed and unleashed endless hordes of traitors, including the Imperial army, beastmen, cultists, and mutants. These attacks were largely distractionary measures to support the traitors' true objectives as they ravaged the planet, and supported the traitor aerial attacks on the palace's anti-ship guns and void shield generators. The loyalists responded with their own aerial defenses, and massive dogfights erupted over the palace as the conscripts in the outermost trenches around the walls held against the attacks by the lost and the damned. While the palace held, major population centers across Terra fell, such as London, Noe Zealand Hive, Neark, and Braslia. As the weeks wore on, the Death Guard fleet under the now corrupted Mortarion arrived at Terra. Horus had promised to let Mortarion's legion be the first to set foot upon Terra, and he prepared to use the Death Guard in the first Astartes-led assaults on the palace. This caused Angron to rage, and he was teleported by World Eater's 8th Company Captain Khan into the ever-shifting labyrinth originally built for Vulcan, aboard the Night Lord's flagship Nightfall to prevent him from destroying his own flagship, the Conqueror. On the 7th of Quartus, the first Death Guard drop pods landed on Terra's soil as the 9 disciples of Kelbahal each beached one of their Arch Mechanicus class battleships around the palace. The void shields and bulk of the Arch Mechanicus vessels allowed the traitors to establish their first real footholds around the palace. As the Death Guard unleashed gas and plagues upon the trenches around the walls, the Dark Mechanicum set about their work of constructing siege engines. Meanwhile, aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus had finally allowed Perturabo to begin his preparations to clear landing zones around the palace for their Titans. The Iron Warriors started to construct landing zones and fortifications while the World Eaters, under the leadership of Khan, continued to ravage the Imperial defenders. As the days passed, the traitors continued their assaults, but the Imperial defenders were able to hold their ground. The defenders were bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements from other loyalist Space Marine legions, including the Ultramarines and the Blood Angels. The arrival of these reinforcements gave the defenders a much-needed boost in morale and firepower. Horus had managed to capture 2 of the key spaceports, the Lion's Gate and Eternity Wall, which had allowed him to land his last and greatest reserves, the Legio Mortis Titan Legion. The traitor forces were now at the gates of the Imperial Palace, the stronghold that housed the Emperor and the last defenders of the Imperium. The loyalist forces were outnumbered and outgunned, and morale was low. Many of the mortal defenders had succumbed to waves of madness that had swept across their ranks, caused by the demon Vasikella, who had infected the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the warp. The siege of the Imperial Palace soon ground on for many days, with the two primary attacks during this time being made by Angron and his World Eaters supported by demon engines in one sector, and the Legio Mortis in the other. Major breaches were made at the Mercury and Exultant wall zones, and the way to the Sanctum Imperialis was now clear. The Loyalist defenders seemed doomed, with many seeing the battle now as a suicidal final stand rather than one in which they could emerge victorious. Despite the dire situation, the Loyalist defenders held on. The Emperor himself had retreated to the Sanctum Imperialis, leaving his custodian guard and the Sisters of Silence to lead the defense. They fought with tenacity and skill, repelling wave after wave of traitor assaults. The custodians proved to be formidable warriors, and the Sisters of Silence wielded their anti-psyker abilities to great effect against the traitors and their demonic allies. As the siege of the Imperial Palace wore on, the White Scars and their Primarch Jagatai Khan continued to hold out hope for victory. Despite the grim situation, the Khan was determined to make a move and retake the Lion's Gate spaceport. Rogal Dorn, the Imperial Fist's Primarch and acting commander of the Loyalist forces on Terra, did not try to stop the Khan's plan. Overworked and exhausted, he knew he could not control his brother and believed that the White Scars were the only hope for victory. At the time of the White Scars assault, the situation on Terra was grim. The traitors had already breached the Imperial Palace's outer walls and were making steady progress towards the Emperor's throne room. The Loyalists, on the other hand, were holed up inside the palace, desperately trying to hold off the traitor forces. The odds seemed insurmountable, and many of the Loyalists had resigned themselves to defeat. However, the White Scars and their Primarch remained optimistic, convinced that victory was still within their grasp. The plan to retake the Lion's Gate spaceport was a risky one. The spaceport was heavily defended by the Death Guard, one of the traitor legions, and their Primarch, Mortarion, had made it his headquarters. The White Scars would have to launch a massive assault against the traitors, using tanks, infantry, and jet bikes to break through their defenses. It was a daunting prospect, but the Khan was determined to succeed. To prepare for the assault, the Khan mustered not only the entire White Scars Legion but also the Terran 1st Armored and the Sky Fortress, the last orbital plate on Terra that until now was being used as an airborne carrier and fire support platform. The plan was to launch a coordinated attack, with different White Scars battlefronts attacking from different directions. Gold Battlefront under Ganzrig Noyan Khan struck an arrowhead across the northern sections of the spaceport approaches, while Ebony under Chin Fai Noyan Khan attacked the southern flank. Jagatai Khan himself led Amber Battlefront through the center and directly into the thickest enemy defenses. The White Scars assault was ferocious, with thousands of tanks and infantry pushing towards the spaceport. The Sky Fortress provided fire support from above, raining down devastating firepower on the traitors. However, the fighting was intense, and the Loyalists suffered heavy casualties as they clashed with the Death Guard and their demonic and mutant allies. A war of attrition broke out, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. As the fighting raged on, the Khan was able to fight his way into the heart of the spaceport and confront Mortarion himself. The two old enemies exchanged few words before engaging in a final duel. Mortarion had become stronger, having given in to the powers of the warp, while the Khan had remained true to the Emperor. Despite being brutally beaten down, the Khan was able to find a weakness in Mortarion's pride, scolding him for being weak and giving in to the powers of the warp. Mortarion flew into a rage, which the Khan took advantage of to launch a second wave of dizzying attacks that overwhelmed the Primarch. In the end, the Khan was badly wounded but managed to impale Mortarion on the blade of his scythe, before decapitating him. The loyalist Primarch was impaled on the blade of Mortarion's scythe, but he simply pulled his body along its length to get face to face with the Death Guard Primarch. In a moment of defiance, the Khan decapitated Mortarion, who was banished into the warp in a massive explosion similar to that of a vortex weapon. The death of Mortarion was a significant victory for the Imperium. It was not only a major blow to the traitor forces but also a symbolic triumph for the loyalists, as the Khan had slain one of the most powerful and infamous traitor primarchs. However, the victory came at a great cost. The Khan was badly wounded in the battle and was left for dead. His body was discovered by Ilya Ravalian and Jangsai Khan, who managed to save his life. In the aftermath of the Khan's seeming death, the White Scars were thrown into a frenzy and prepared to throw their lives away in a final charge against the Death Guard. The sudden tenacity surprised the Death Guard, who without Mortarion to guide them were forced back. Thanks to the efforts of Ilya Ravalian and Shaban Khan, the White Scars decided to remain at Lion's Gate Spaceport and secure it for the Loyalists instead of pressing on into certain death. With the death of Mortarion, Typhus became the de facto leader of the Death Guard. He was determined to avenge his fallen Primarch and continued to lead his forces against the Loyalists. However, he faced fierce resistance from the White Scars and the Imperial Army, who were emboldened by their recent victory. The Loyalists fought with renewed vigor and managed to hold off the traitors. But even as the defenders celebrated their hard-won victory, they knew that the battle was far from over. With the death of Mortarion, Typhus became the de facto leader of the Death Guard. He was determined to avenge his fallen Primarch and continued to lead his forces against the Loyalists. The Khan's intervention gave the Loyalists a much-needed respite and a chance to regroup. Despite the valiant efforts of the Loyalist defenders, the traitors had managed to breach the Lion's Gate Spaceport and pour into the inner palace, overwhelming everything in their path. Even the Bab Bastion, Dorn's command center, had fallen under siege, with the Imperial Fist's Primarch still inside. As the situation grew increasingly dire, the Emperor's psychic shield was stretched to its breaking point, thanks in no small part to the constant immaterial assault by the twisted form of Magnus in the Webway. To try and put an end to the Crimson King's machinations, Vulcan was dispatched into the Webway to find and kill Magnus before he could succeed. Meanwhile, the traitor forces had devolved into a barbaric horde, murdering all in their path as they surged towards the Sanctum Imperialis. The defenders, vastly outnumbered, mustered on the Delphic battlement before the processional to the Eternity Gate. These were mainly Blood Angels and Imperial Army, but other Loyalists such as the Imperial Fists, White Scars, Legio Ignatum, and Mechanicum were also represented. With a vast horde of traitorous darts, Imperial Army, Beastmen, Mutants, Daimons, Titans, and other horrors massed on the horizon, the defenders knew that they faced certain death. Nevertheless, Sanguinius organized a defense, determined to buy precious time for his father, the Emperor. At dawn, the traitors erected the mutilated but still living Loyalist prisoners they had captured, nailing them to banners, crosses, vehicles, or whatever else they could find to try and break the spirit of the defenders. Next, the Daughter of Torment, a Reaver Titan of the traitorous Legio Mordaxis, marched forward. In its power claw was the tortured form of Blood Angel's Captain Ida Mars, a grim reminder of the traitor's ruthlessness. The Daughter of Torment issued Horus conditions: any who fled the coming battle would be granted a pardon by Horus, the new Emperor of mankind. Sanguinius responded with a rousing speech to the defenders, stating that he would stand and fight, but all others were free to go where they wished. Inspired or perhaps shamed by the Great Angel, it is believed that no loyalists took the opportunity to leave. Instead, all present pledged themselves to Sanguinius, determined to stand and fight until the bitter end. As battle erupted, Sanguinius took to the skies, his wings beating a thunderous rhythm as he soared towards the Daughter of Torment. With a mighty swing of his sword, he beheaded the Reaver Titan, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks and smoke. The defenders, emboldened by their leader's heroism, charged forward, determined to hold the line against the traitor horde. The battle was brutal and bloody, with loyalist and traitor forces locked in a deadly struggle that seemed to have no end. The defenders fought with every ounce of strength they possessed, knowing that the fate of the Imperium rested on their shoulders. The traitors, however, were equally determined, fueled by their hatred and their desire for revenge against the Emperor and all he stood for. Despite the odds, the defenders held the line. The traitors were pushed back, their ranks thinned by the relentless onslaught of the loyalists. For a brief moment, it seemed as though victory was within reach. But then, the tide of battle turned. The traitors, bolstered by their demonic allies, launched a ferocious counterattack. The loyalists fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The battlefield became a bloody and chaotic melee, with Astartes, Imperial army soldiers, daimons, and beasts fighting for their respective sides. Sanguinius himself led the charge, cutting down traitor after traitor with his immense sword. His wings blazed with holy fire, and his eyes burned with righteous fury. He was a true angel of death, inspiring his troops to fight on despite the overwhelming odds. But even the Primarch could not withstand the might of the traitor horde forever. He was eventually overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and was forced to retreat to the Eternity Gate with the remaining loyalists. The traitors pursued them relentlessly, their howls of triumph echoing across the blasted landscape. The defenders fought with all their might, but it was a losing battle. One by one, they fell to the traitors' blades, their blood staining the ground red. The Imperial fists fought bravely alongside their Blood Angels brethren, but they too were eventually overwhelmed. Dorn himself was rumored to have fallen, although the truth of this is uncertain. The Mechanicum and Legio Ignatum did what they could to hold back the traitors' advance, unleashing volleys of plasma and gunfire. The Titans of the Legio Mortis roamed the battlefield, crushing anything in their path. But it was all for naught. The traitors were simply too numerous and too powerful. As the loyalists retreated towards the Eternity Gate, they were beset on all sides by traitors. They fought desperately, using every trick and tactic they knew to stay alive. The Blood Angels unleashed their fury, tearing apart traitor Astartes with their bare hands. The Imperial army soldiers fired their last guns relentlessly, mowing down wave after wave of traitors. But still the enemy came on, their blades dripping with blood and their eyes glowing with unholy power. Finally, the loyalists reached the Eternity Gate. It was their last hope, their final refuge. They fought tooth and nail to hold back the traitors, but it was clear that they could not hold out forever. The traitors were pushing closer and closer, their demonic allies shrieking and gibbering in triumph. The battle was brutal and unforgiving. The traitors, bolstered by their demonic allies, launched a ferocious counterattack. The loyalists held the line for a brief moment, pushing back the traitors and thinning their ranks with their relentless onslaught. But then, the tide of battle turned. The traitors, fueled by their hatred and their demonic allies, launched a final, desperate assault. In the midst of this carnage, Sanguinius stood tall, leading his warriors with a ferocity that left the traitors stunned. He cut down traitors wherever they appeared, his sword flashing in the dim light of the battle. But then, he was assailed by the bloodthirster Ka'Banda, the same creature he had fought at Cygnus. Despite being weakened from his fight with Ka'Banda, Sanguinius stood his ground and fought on. The two Primarchs battled fiercely, soaring through the skies above Terra. Sanguinius was able to break the creature's back with the hilt of his sword, sending the demon back to the earth to be consumed by lesser of his kind. But even as he struck down the bloodthirster, Sanguinius knew that his time was running out. His demonic brother Angron was closing in, and the two would soon face each other in battle. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters, was a brutal and savage warrior. He had long ago been implanted with the Butcher's Nails, a device that increased his aggression and made him a more effective killer. But it also drove him mad, and he had become a bloodthirsty monster who reveled in slaughter. As Angron approached, Sanguinius could see the madness in his eyes. He knew that this would be a battle to the death, and that he would need to use all of his skill and strength to prevail. The two Primarchs clashed in a storm of blood and fire. Sanguinius fought with all of his might, but he was weakened from his previous battles. Angron, on the other hand, was fueled by his rage and the power of the Butcher's Nails. For a time, the battle was evenly matched. The two warriors traded blows, each one trying to gain the upper hand. But then, Angron landed a devastating blow, impaling Sanguinius on his black blade. Sanguinius felt the sword pierce his flesh, but he did not falter. Instead, he used the opportunity to rip out Angron's Butcher's Nails. The device had been implanted in the Primarch's brain, and without it, he was defenseless. Angron's head exploded as the nails were ripped out, and the demon Primarch was banished into the warp. The World Eaters, who had been fighting alongside Angron, lost whatever sanity they had left and began to turn on their own allies. Though they had successfully defended the Eternity Gate, the traitor legions were still advancing on all fronts, and the remaining loyalist officers found themselves leading desperate, but ultimately futile defenses of the last bastions inside the inner palace. Chaos forces were in a state of complete disarray, and many of the Astartes had broken ranks, but vast demonic legions spilled forth onto Terra's soil. Despite their bravery and resilience, the loyalists were quickly pushed back. The Bab Bastion fell to the sons of Horus forces under Tarkis Malabru, forcing Rogal Dorn to retreat into the Sanctum Imperialis. All order and discipline had broken down among the traitor legions, but Horus had more than made up for this with the power of his demonic allies. As the battle raged on, concepts such as time and space began to break down, and Terra itself started to slowly be sucked into the warp, with the Vengeful Spirit acting as its conduit. The sheer magnitude of the warp energies involved caused hours to pass like weeks, and the entire planet seemed to be in a state of turmoil. All across Terra, traitor armies and maddened souls began to chant the name of the Dark King. Horus had ascended to the position of Warmaster of Chaos, and now aspired to become the fifth god of Chaos, born from humanity just as Slanesh had been born from the Eldar. Despite the seemingly insurmountable odds, the Loyalists fought on. The remaining Space Marine chapters and the Imperial army fought with all their might, determined to protect the Emperor and prevent Horus from achieving his goal of destroying the Imperium. But it was clear that they were fighting a losing battle, and that the end was near. In the midst of this chaos, the Emperor himself prepared to lead the final assault on the Vengeful Spirit. Though he had been warned by Sanguinius of his prophetic visions of his own death at the hands of Horus, the Emperor was undeterred. He knew that the fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders, and that the only way to defeat Horus was to face him head-on. The Emperor gathered his most trusted advisors, including Malkador the Sigillite and the Primarchs Rogal Dorn and Vulcan, and prepared to launch the final assault. With the fate of the Imperium hanging in the balance, the Emperor and his loyal followers set out to confront Horus and his traitor legions aboard the Vengeful Spirit. As the Emperor and his custodes teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit, they were met with a barrage of psychic energy from Horus, who had been waiting for them. Horus had been planning this moment for a long time, and he had set a trap that would lure the Emperor into a deadly battle that would decide the fate of the Imperium. He had held back his full strength, clouded his mind in dementia, and allowed the Emperor to believe that he was weaker than he actually was. And now, he was ready to strike. As the Emperor and his custodes emerged from the teleportation vortex, they found themselves in a seemingly ordinary hangar. But it was a trap, and Horus had already taken control of many of the companions. Blood flowed from their eyes, and they screamed as they attacked their liege lord. The Emperor was forced to fight back, and he slew dozens of custodes before the madness passed. He was able to cleanse the lingering taint from his companions, but the battle was far from over. The Emperor and his custodes found themselves in the midst of hell, with diamonds and chaos warriors attacking them from every side. They fell into traps, and many were lost in the chaos. But the Emperor unleashed his psychic fire, and he cleansed the darkness with a burst of divine power. His custodes fought bravely by his side, and they managed to hold off the enemy long enough to reach their ultimate goal, the confrontation with Horus. Meanwhile, Valder and his custodes were battling hordes of diamonds deep within a dark vault. They had no idea where they were or what was happening, but they fought with all their might. Valder, the Captain General, stabbed the surface with his Apollonian spear, and he confirmed their destination. They were aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and they were fighting for the fate of the Imperium. Dorn found himself in an endless sweltering desert, and he was slowly losing his mind. He had forgotten all but his name, and he was tempted by cornate madness. But he fought back, and he managed to retain his sanity long enough to make it to the final battle. Only Sanguinius and his Blood Angels reached their original destination, Disembarkation Deck 2. They faced determined resistance from Diamonds, Sons of Horus, and Word-Bearers, but they fought on. Sanguinius refused Horus' final offer to join him in his campaign against the Emperor, and he found himself completely outmatched by the Warmaster. Horus, now warped by the powers of chaos, struck him down, and the Emperor arrived just in time to witness the brutal scene. The Emperor was overwhelmed by sorrow as he saw the mauled corpse of Sanguinius at Horus' feet. He was speechless, and Horus mocked him, proclaiming himself the rightful ruler of humanity. Horus claimed to have bound the Chaos Gods to his will, and he was determined to destroy the Emperor and take over the Imperium. The Emperor could only look on in pity, knowing all too well the trap that had ensnared his son. He knew that Horus had become a slave to chaos, not the other way around. And so, the great duel began. The fate of humanity hung in the balance as the Emperor and Horus clashed in a fierce battle of wills and power. The two titans of the Imperium fought with everything they had, unleashing unimaginable amounts of psychic energy and physical might. The Emperor's power was unmatched, but Horus had the backing of the Chaos Gods, who fueled his every move with dark energy. The two warriors clashed in an epic battle that shook the very foundations of the Vengeful Spirit. The power unleashed by their attacks was so great that it threatened to tear the ship apart. As the battle raged on, the Emperor began to gain the upper hand. He could sense the desperation in Horus, who knew he was fighting a losing battle. The Warmaster's attacks grew weaker and less frequent, as the Emperor's power continued to grow. In a final, desperate move, Horus unleashed all the power of the Chaos Gods against the Emperor. The sheer force of the attack was devastating, and the Emperor was thrown back, his armor shattered and his body broken. For a moment, it seemed as if Horus had won. But the Emperor was not beaten yet. With the last of his strength, he unleashed a final attack that obliterated Horus and shattered the very fabric of reality. The Vengeful Spirit was torn apart in the maelstrom of energy unleashed by the two combatants, and the forces of chaos were banished back to the warp. The Emperor knew that his time was at an end. He knew that he could not continue to guide the Imperium as he had done before. And so, he made a final sacrifice. He requested that he be hooked back up to the arcane machine that had sustained him for so long, and that he become one with the Golden Throne. The throne was an ancient device that had been created to amplify the psychic powers of the Emperor, and to allow him to guide humanity through the warp. But now, it would become his prison, and his final resting place. As the Emperor's life force was transferred to the Golden Throne, his body was racked with pain. The machine was designed to channel massive amounts of energy, and the Emperor's psychic power was no exception. In the end, the strain was too great. Malcador, the Emperor's closest friend and confidant, was reduced to a pile of dust from the strain of controlling the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon in the Emperor's absence. But the Emperor's sacrifice was not in vain. He knew that he was leaving the fate of humanity in the hands of his remaining Primarchs. For the next 10,000 years, the Emperor remained interned on the Golden Throne. His body had been reduced to a mere shell, sustained by its advanced technology and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. But his mind remained active, guiding the Imperium through the warp and watching over his beloved sons from afar. The Horus Heresy did not end with the Battle of Terra. The Loyalists still had to drive the remaining rebels from the Imperium, one world at a time. In what became known as the Great Scouring, the traitorous forces of chaos were eventually driven into the Eye of Terror. But the cost of victory was high. Millions of lives were lost, and the Imperium was forever changed. The Primarchs, once the Emperor's greatest warriors, became embittered and divided. Some turned to worship the Chaos gods, while others sought to maintain the legacy of their father. And so, the Imperium entered a new era. The Emperor's legacy would live on, but it would be up to his sons to determine the fate of humanity. The Imperium would face many challenges in the years to come, but it would continue to endure, as long as the light of the Emperor burned bright in the hearts of his followers.